Welcome. Something extraordinary is waiting to be uncovered, and it has been waiting for a very long time. Imagine a kingdom so powerful that a Persian prophet in the 3rd century placed it alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 greatest empires on Earth. Not in Europe, not in Asia, but here, rising from the red volcanic highlands of Africa, from the thin air and ancient stone of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. A civilization that minted its own gold coins, raised granite towers taller than 10-story buildings from single uncut blocks of stone, commanded the Red Sea trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and became one of the first states on Earth to adopt Christianity as its official religion. This was Aksum, and most of the world has never heard its full story. That changes now. What you are about to experience is the complete journey of the Aksumite Empire, from its earliest roots in the ancient Deemed Kingdom of around 800 BCE, through the crystallization of a great urban civilization, across the centuries of its commercial dominance, its royal ambitions, its faith, and its extraordinary reach into the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to its long retreat, and the living legacy it left behind in the churches, scripts, and sacred traditions that endure to this very day. We will walk through the honey-colored limestone walls of the Temple of Yeha, one of the oldest standing structures in sub-Saharan Africa. We will stand in the steely fields of Aksum, where granite obelisks carved to resemble multi-story palaces still pierce the highland sky. We will trace the gold coins of Aksumite kings as they circulated from the Red Sea port of Obelisks to the markets of Rome and India. We will follow King Ezana as he transforms an empire's soul and sail with King Caleb across the Red Sea on one of the ancient world's most dramatic military expeditions. And we will witness how a kingdom that lost its ports, its forests, and its trade routes still refused to disappear, its language, its church, and its founding myths surviving into the 21st century. This is not a fragment. This is not an overview. This is the full passage through the life of one of history's most remarkable and most overlooked civilizations, told with the depth, the detail, and the reverence it deserves. The red earth of the Tigray highlands remembers everything. The granite stelae still stand. The Ge'ez script still lives in the mouths of millions. The story of Aksum is not a story of the past. It is a story that never truly ended. If you feel drawn to these complete journeys through the ancient world, civilizations told in full, from their first breath to their lasting echo, we invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Each week, we open another door into a lost world and walk through it together, all the way to the end. The highlands are waiting. The stone is speaking. Let us begin. The highlands remember everything. At roughly 2,200 meters above sea level, the Tigray Plateau rises from the Horn of Africa like a vast ancient table, its red volcanic soils cracked by centuries of sun, its escarpments falling away toward distant lowlands where the air thickens and the heat becomes absolute. This is not gentle terrain. It demands endurance. And from that demand, civilization was born. Long before the name Aksum meant anything to the ancient world, these highlands were already inhabited, already cultivated, already contested. The volcanic soils here are extraordinarily fertile, enriched by millennia of geological activity, watered by seasonal rains that sweep in from the Indian Ocean, and protected by elevation from the malarial lowlands below. Communities that settled here did not merely survive, they accumulated surplus, and surplus across all of human history is the first condition of power. By approximately 800 BCE, a recognizable kingdom had crystallized in this landscape. Scholars call it Dimit, a polity centered in the Tigray region of what is now northern Ethiopia, with its spiritual and political heart near the town of Yeha. What Damit left behind is extraordinary. The Temple of Almaka at Yeha, dated to approximately 700 BCE, still stands in partial form today. Its honey-colored limestone blocks fitted with a precision that speaks of organized labor, specialized craft, and a ruling class capable of commanding both. The temple was dedicated to Almaka, a South Arabian moon deity, and its architectural vocabulary. The dressed stone courses, the rectangular plan, the careful orientation, mirrors temples built across the Red Sea in the ancient Sabaean kingdom of what is now Yemen. This connection is not coincidental. Across the narrow strait of the Bab el-Mandeb, South Arabian traders, migrants, and perhaps colonists had been crossing into the Horn of Africa for generations. They brought with them a script, the ancient Sabaean alphabet, that would eventually evolve through centuries of local adaptation into Ge'ez, the written language of Aksum and the liturgical tongue of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to this day. They brought religious traditions, architectural techniques, and agricultural knowledge, but they did not replace the people already here. They merged with them. The indigenous Cushitic-speaking communities of the Tigray highlands absorbed these arrivals, blending South Arabian influences with their own deep traditions of highland farming, cattle herding, and territorial organization. The result was not a transplanted Arabian culture. It was something genuinely new, a highland synthesis that drew from multiple worlds while belonging entirely to its own geography. Diamt flourished between roughly 800 and 400 BCE, then fades from the archaeological record, likely dissolving into smaller successor polities, rather than collapsing catastrophically. What followed was a long period of Proto-Aksumite formation, communities growing more complex, trade networks extending further, the Mareb River Valley providing a natural corridor toward Red Sea access at the coast. The plateau's elevation, never a barrier, became a strategic advantage, commanding visibility, defensible terrain, and a climate cool enough to sustain dense agricultural populations. By the final centuries BCE, the foundations were fully laid. The soils had been terraced and tended across generations. The scripts were being adapted and refined. The trade routes were established. The stoneworking traditions that would one day raise granite obelisks 30 meters into the highland sky were already being practiced in the quarries near Yeha and beyond. The red earth had been patient. It had held the memory of every settlement, every harvest, every temple stone carefully placed. Now, slowly, and with the deliberate weight of deep time, it was preparing to offer that memory to a kingdom that would astonish the ancient world. The granite does not forget. 4 kilometers west of the ancient city, at a place called Gobedra Hill, the stone was already waiting, great outcroppings of fine-grained granite, pale and dense, formed across hundreds of millions of years beneath the highland earth. Sometime in the final centuries before the Common Era, hands began working that stone with iron tools, cutting along natural grain lines, shaping blocks of extraordinary precision. What emerged from those quarries would become one of the most distinctive architectural statements in the ancient world. The city of Aksum sits at 14.1 degrees north latitude, 38.7 degrees east longitude, cradled between low ridges in a highland basin where seasonal rains collect and the soil runs deep. By the 1st century BCE, It was no longer simply a settlement. Archaeological excavations have revealed the unmistakable signature of deliberate urban planning. Elite residential compounds built on raised stone platforms, drainage channels cut into bedrock, storage facilities, and the earliest evidence of monumental tomb construction. A civilization was no longer merely surviving in this landscape. It was inscribing itself upon it. The stelae rose first as markers, tall, narrow granite obelisks carved to resemble the facades of multi-story buildings. False doors were cut into their bases. Rows of false windows climbed their faces in careful registers, each one framing nothing but air and intention. These were not functional structures. They were declarations. Each stele announced that here, in this highland basin, a people had mastered stone at a scale that demanded acknowledgement. The granite blocks were quarried as single pieces, transported across 4 kilometers of highland terrain, and raised upright through engineering methods that remain a subject of scholarly study. Stele 2, which still stands today, reaches 24.6 meters into the highland sky, a single shaft of carved granite that has outlasted every empire that once looked upon it with wonder. Beneath the stele, the dead were honored in chambers of dressed stone. Elite tomb complexes, excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century, reveal burial practices of considerable sophistication. Stone-lined chambers, grave goods of bronze and ivory, evidence of ritual feasting. The stele above and the tombs below formed a single architectural statement about power, continuity, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Above ground, the Ge'ez script was undergoing its own transformation. Descended from the South Arabian Sabian script, carried across the Red Sea by traders and migrants in earlier centuries, Ge'ez was being reshaped by the 1st century BCE into something distinctly Aksumite. The earliest inscriptions carved into stone tablets show a script still close to its South Arabian origins, consonantal, reading right to left. But the language beneath the letters was already the language of the Highland Plateau, not of Arabia. Over the following centuries, Ge'ez would develop vowel notation, becoming one of the earliest alphabets in the world to systematically represent vowel sounds, a linguistic achievement of lasting consequence. The earliest Aksumite rulers emerge from this period as shadows in stone. Inscriptions reference kings by name and title, recording military campaigns conducted against lowland peoples to the south and west. The precise names of these earliest monarchs remain partially obscured by the fragmentary nature of the surviving record, but their actions are legible. Expansion, tribute extraction, the assertion of Highland authority over surrounding territories. A kingdom was consolidating its reach. What the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE reveal, when examined together, is a civilization moving with remarkable purposefulness. The city was planned, the stone was worked, the script was refined, the dead were honored in chambers that required months of labor to construct. None of this happened by accident or impulse. It happened because a society had organized itself around a vision of permanence, a conviction that what was being built here deserved to endure. The red earth of the Tigray highlands was no longer simply holding memory. It was being shaped deliberately and with extraordinary skill into the foundation of an empire that the ancient world would soon be forced to notice. The sea remembers its merchants. Along the western shore of the Red Sea, where the Gulf of Zula cuts into the Eritrean coastline, the ruins of Obelisks lie beneath centuries of accumulated sediment. But in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, This was one of the most consequential harbors in the ancient world. Wooden dhows rode at anchor in the shallow waters. Bales of Highland ivory waited on the quayside. The smell of obsidian dust and cured hides mixed with salt air and the sharp resin of incense carried down from the interior plateau. The Greek merchant manual known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, composed sometime between 40 and 70 CE, describes Adulis with the precision of a man who had walked its docks. It was a lawful market town, the text records, reached after a 2-day journey inland from a bay called Diodorus Island. From Adulis, Aksumite traders sent into the wider world the products of an entire highland civilization, elephant ivory in quantities that made the Mediterranean market dependent on this single source, rhinoceros horn, hippopotamus hides, tortoise shell harvested from the coastal shallows, obsidian blades of volcanic glass sharp enough to cut silk, and enslaved captives taken in campaigns against neighboring lowland peoples. In return, the ships arriving from Egypt, Arabia, and India unloaded Roman wine sealed in ceramic amphorae, olive oil, fine glassware from Syrian workshops, iron for tools and weapons, and cotton textiles woven in India. What the Periplus reveals is not merely a list of commodities. It reveals a kingdom that had mastered the logic of geographic advantage. Aksum sat at the precise intersection of 3 commercial worlds: the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean. And its rulers understood this position with extraordinary clarity. The highland plateau produced the ivory. The Mareb River Valley provided the corridor to the coast. Adulis provided the interface. Control all 3, and the kingdom controlled the flow of wealth across the ancient world's most lucrative maritime corridor. By the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE, Aksum took a step that announced its ambitions to every literate civilization on Earth. It began minting its own coinage, gold, silver, and bronze, bearing the portraits of its kings and inscriptions in both Ge'ez and Greek. This was not a practical necessity. Barter and commodity exchange could have continued indefinitely. The decision to mint coins was a declaration of sovereignty, a statement that Aksum stood among the great powers and expected to be recognized as such. The gold coins were calibrated to weights equivalent to Roman standards, allowing them to circulate in Mediterranean markets without conversion. They bore royal names, titles, and eventually religious symbols, a kingdom encoding its identity into metal small enough to cross any border. The diplomatic implications were immediate. Roman emperors exchanged embassies with Aksumite kings. The Persian Parthian Empire acknowledged Aksumite commercial reach. The Persian prophet Mani, writing in the 3rd century CE, listed Aksum alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the 4 greatest kingdoms on earth, a ranking that reflected not admiration alone, but the observable reality of Aksumite power as seen from the ancient world's center. The port of Adulis was the kingdom's face to that world, but the true engine of Aksumite power remained the highland interior, the terraced fields, the granite workshops, the scribes refining legacies, the kings commissioning monuments. Trade did not replace the civilization that had been built in the red earth of Tigray. It amplified it, flooded it with resources, and gave its rulers the means to project authority far beyond the escarpment's edge. The ancient world had taken notice, and Aksum was only beginning. The stone does not merely stand, it declares. In the ancient Stele field of Aksum, where granite towers rise from the red earth like frozen proclamations, the ambitions of kings are written not in ink, but in mass and height. By the 3rd century CE, The political architecture of the Aksumite kingdom had matured into something recognizable as an imperial system, one with a royal center, subordinate regional rulers, a professional military, and an ideology of divine kingship expressed in stone, metal, and inscription. The trade wealth that had flowed through Obelisks for generations was now being converted into monuments of extraordinary permanence. The great stelae of Aksum belonged to this era of consolidation. Quarried from single granite blocks at Gobedra Hill and transported across 4 kilometers of highland terrain, these obelisks were carved to resemble multi-story buildings, complete with false doors, windows, and beam-end decorations rendered in precise relief. Stele 3, standing at approximately 24 meters, represents the engineering ambition of a state that understood monumental architecture as political language. These were not merely grave markers. They were statements of dynastic continuity, royal power, and civilizational permanence addressed to every generation that would follow. The kings of this period styled themselves with elaborate titles. Aksumite royal inscriptions describe rulers as King of Kings and King of Aksum, Himyar, Raidan, Saba, Salhen, Tsiamo, Beja, and Kasu. A list of territories that reveals both the geographic reach of Aksumite authority and the ideological ambition behind it. These titles were not mere decoration. They reflected genuine campaigns of military expansion into neighboring lowland territories, the subjugation of pastoral peoples along the Nile corridor, and the projection of highland power into regions that had long existed beyond any single political authority. It is into this expanding kingdom that King Ezana emerges around 320 CE, a ruler whose reign would compress into a single generation the full force of Aksumite imperial ambition. Ezana's campaigns are documented in a series of stone inscriptions, some in Ge'ez, some in Sabaean, some in Greek, that constitute among the most significant primary sources surviving from ancient Africa. His trilingual inscription stone, discovered in Aksum in 1981, carries a structural parallel to the Rosetta Stone in its layered linguistic testimony, a document written for multiple audiences across the ancient world simultaneously. Ezana's military campaigns targeted the Noba and Kasu peoples of the Middle Nile region with systematic force. His inscriptions describe river crossings, the burning of settlements, the capture of cattle and prisoners, and the imposition of Aksumite authority over territories stretching deep into what is now Sudan. Around 350 CE, Aksumite forces reached the ancient city of Meroe, capital of the Kushite kingdom that had endured for centuries along the Nile, and destroyed it. The pyramid fields of Meroe still stand today in the Sudanese desert, silent witnesses to a civilization that Aksumite power brought to its final end. Yet, even as Ezana's armies moved through the Nile corridor, other forces were entering the kingdom from a different direction entirely. Syrian Christian missionaries and the figures later venerated as the 9 saints were beginning to move through the Aksumite highlands, carrying a faith that would prove more transformative than any military campaign. The kingdom that had built its identity on royal divine authority and the ancient gods of the highland pantheon was approaching a threshold. The age of conquest had reached its fullest expression. What came next would change everything. The change did not arrive as conquest. It arrived as a shipwreck. Sometime in the early 4th century CE, a merchant vessel crossing the Red Sea was attacked near the Ethiopian coast. Among the survivors pulled from the wreckage were 2 young Syrian Christians, brothers named Frumentius and Aedesius. They were brought to the Aksumite court, where their education and intelligence earned them positions of trust. Aedesius eventually returned home. Frumentius remained. He became secretary and treasurer to the Aksumite king, and later tutor to the young prince who would become Ezana. In the intimate proximity of the royal household, a faith took root. This is not legend dressed as history. The account survives in the writings of Rufinus of Aquileia, a 4th century church historian who claimed to have heard it directly from Aedesius himself. The details are specific, the chronology traceable. Around 328 CE, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria and appealed to Athanasius, the great bishop of Alexandria and defender of Nicene Christianity, to send a bishop to Aksum. Athanasius's response was direct. He consecrated Frumentius himself as the first bishop of Aksum, the man the Ethiopians would venerate as Abba Salama, Father of Peace, returned to the Highland Kingdom carrying the full weight of apostolic authority. What followed was not a sudden rupture, but a measured transformation. Around 330 CE, King Ezana, the same ruler whose military inscriptions had proclaimed campaigns against the Noba and the destruction of Meroe, began issuing coins that carried a new symbol. The crescent and disk, ancient emblems of the sun and moon deities that had appeared on Aksumite coinage since its introduction, began to disappear. In their place, centered on the face of gold, silver, and bronze coins, appeared the cross. The transition is datable with precision. Coins bearing the cross are confirmed from approximately 333 CE onward. No other act of state makes the conversion more legible. In the language of metal and mint, the kingdom had changed its allegiance. The inscriptions followed. Where Ezana's earlier victory texts had invoked Maharem, the god of war, and the Highland pantheon of Aksumite tradition, his later inscriptions address the Lord of heaven and earth, the Christian God, as the source of his victories and authority. The ideological architecture of the kingdom was being rebuilt in a new image, stone by stone, word by word. The construction of the original Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion in Aksum, belongs to this transformative period. Tradition dates the first structure to the 4th century CE, making it among the earliest purpose-built Christian churches on African soil. The site carries a significance that extends far beyond architecture. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest described in Hebrew scripture, was brought to Aksum by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and rests within this church to this day. Whether history or sacred memory, the claim has shaped Ethiopian identity across 17 centuries without interruption. By the close of the 4th century, Christianity had moved from the royal court outward into the fabric of Aksumite society. The 9 saints, Syrian and Eastern Mediterranean missionaries who arrived in the 5th century and are venerated as the founders of Ethiopian monasticism, would deepen this transformation in the generations that followed. But the foundation was laid in Ezana's reign, a kingdom that had defined itself through military power and divine kingship, now carried a cross on its coins, a church at its center, and a faith that would outlast the empire itself by more than 1,000 years. The highlands had absorbed many things: South Arabian scripts, Roman trade goods, Kushite territory. Now they absorbed a religion, and unlike the others, this one never left. The faith had taken root. Now the kingdom grew around it. In the 5th century CE, Aksum does not merely exist, it accumulates. Wealth moves through it like water through stone, carving channels that deepen with each generation. The highlands that once sheltered Proto-Aksumite farmers now support a civilization of extraordinary complexity, and the city at its center has become something the ancient world recognizes as a true capital: dense, layered, purposeful, and rich. The ivory arrives first. It comes from the lowland savannas far to the south and west, from the elephant grounds of what is now Sudan and Somalia, carried by hunters and intermediary traders through a network of paths that descend from the Tigray escarpment toward the hot plains below. The tusks are heavy, cream-colored, and immensely valuable. In Byzantine Constantinople and in the workshops of Alexandria, ivory is the material of emperors, carved into diptychs, throne panels, and sacred objects. Aksum controls the supply. That control is the foundation of everything. At Obelisks, the port city on the Gulf of Zula, the ivory is weighed, cataloged, and loaded onto wooden vessels that ride the seasonal monsoon winds north and east. Byzantine merchants receive it. Persian traders negotiate for it. In exchange, Aksum receives silk, fine glassware, wine in ceramic amphorae, and the spices of the Indian Ocean world. The transaction is ancient, but in the 5th century it reaches a volume and sophistication that places Aksum among the wealthiest states on earth. The city itself reflects this wealth in stone. The Dungur Palace complex, constructed in approximately the 6th century CE on the western edge of Aksum, covers some 3,200 square meters. It rises from a dressed stone podium, its rooms arranged around a central hall, its walls built with the alternating timber and stone technique called monkey head construction that gives Aksumite architecture its distinctive texture. This is not a fortress. It is a residence of power, designed to impress through proportion and permanence. Around the palace district, the city breathes with daily life. Craftsmen work bronze into oil lamps of elegant design, lamps that archaeologists would later recover not only in Ethiopia, but in India and Sri Lanka, carried there by the same trade winds that brought foreign goods to Obelisks. Goldsmiths produce jewelry of fine granulation. Scribes bend over stretch vellum, copying the Ge'ez Bible, a translation completed by the 9 saints, the Syrian missionaries who had arrived in the 5th century and established the monasteries that would anchor Ethiopian Christianity for centuries. The markets hold obsidian from the Danakil Depression, incense from the southern highlands, cotton textiles from India, and the bronze and iron tools of Aksumite manufacture. The city's population moves through these spaces with the confidence of people who understand that the world comes to them. In the necropolis outside the city, the tomb of the false door stands as a monument to Aksumite beliefs about death and continuity. Its carved stone entrance, a door that opens to nothing, that leads nowhere visible, speaks to a civilization navigating the transition between older funerary traditions and the new Christian cosmology reshaping its understanding of the afterlife. Then comes Caleb. Around 514 CE, King Caleb ascends the Aksumite throne, and the kingdom reaches the outermost boundary of its ambition. His reign represents not merely continuation, but acceleration. A moment when Aksum looks beyond its highlands, beyond its port, beyond the Red Sea itself, and decides that its power extends to the shores of Arabia. The world is about to learn how far an African empire can reach. The Red Sea at dawn holds its silence like a secret. The water moves in long, slow swells, catching the first light in fragments, copper, then gold, then the pale blue of full morning. On the western shore, the highlands of Aksum rise behind their coastal approaches. On the eastern shore, the Arabian Peninsula waits. Between them, The sea that made Aksum rich is about to become the sea that carries its armies. The crisis arrives from the east. Around 517 CE, the Himyarite kingdom of southern Arabia, centered in what is now Yemen, falls under the rule of a king named Yusuf Asar Yathar, known to history as Dhu Nuwas. He is a convert to Judaism, and his reign marks a sharp turn against the Christian communities that Aksumite influence had helped establish across the Arabian Peninsula. In the city of Najran, in present-day southwestern Saudi Arabia, a prosperous Christian community has existed for generations. Dhu Nuwas moves against them with deliberate violence. Around 517 to 518 CE, thousands of Najran's Christians are massacred, burned according to contemporary accounts preserved in Syriac and Greek sources, in trenches dug for that purpose. The event sends tremors through the late antique world. News reaches Constantinople. Byzantine Emperor Justin I, who shares with Caleb both the Christian faith and the strategic interest in Red Sea commerce, sends urgent diplomatic appeals to the Aksumite king. The request is precise: cross the sea, remove Dhu Nuwas, and restore Christian order to Arabia. For Caleb, the appeal aligns perfectly with Aksumite ambition. The campaign is not merely religious duty, it is empire. Around 525 CE, Caleb assembles a naval force of extraordinary scale. Ancient sources suggest a fleet of perhaps 70 ships or more, carrying thousands of soldiers across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and northward along the Arabian coast. The logistics alone represent a remarkable feat, coordinating vessels, provisions, weapons, and men across open water in service of a campaign hundreds of kilometers from the Aksumite heartland. The Aksumite navy, long practiced in Red Sea commerce, now demonstrates that it can project military power as effectively as it moves ivory and gold. Dhu Nuwas is defeated and killed around 525 CE. Some accounts describe him riding his horse into the sea rather than surrendering, a detail that may be legend, but that captures the totality of his defeat. Caleb installs a Christian viceroy named Sumyafa Ashwa over the Himyarite kingdom, extending Aksumite authority across the water in a formal act of imperial governance. For a brief moment, an African highland kingdom holds dominion over a portion of the Arabian Peninsula. The arrangement does not hold. Around 531 CE, an Aksumite general named Abraha leads a second intervention, displaces Sumyafa Ashwa, and establishes himself as ruler of Himyar. Caleb sends forces to remove him. They fail. Abraha consolidates power, declares effective independence from Aksum, yet maintains Christianity as the religion of his kingdom. He builds churches, repairs the ancient Marib Dam, that great engineering monument of pre-Islamic Arabia, and rules for decades. His shadow extends even further. Around 570 CE, decades after Caleb's death, Abraha's son launches a campaign northward toward Mecca with war elephants, an event recorded in the Quran itself as the Year of the Elephant in Surah al-Fil. Caleb does not live to see these consequences unfold. After his campaigns, the Aksumite king makes a choice that no military victory can explain. He abdicates his throne, sends his crown to Jerusalem, and withdraws into monastic life. The highland kingdom that reached across the sea to reshape Arabia is left to successors who will face a world already beginning to change around them. The Red Sea, so long Aksum's instrument of power, is about to become someone else's road. The world that Caleb left behind is already contracting. Not suddenly, not through a single catastrophic blow, but through the slow accumulation of pressures that no throne inscription can record and no military campaign can reverse. The highlands of Tigray, which once sustained an empire, are beginning to show the cost of centuries of ambition. The evidence lies in the soil itself. Palynological studies of sediment cores drawn from highland lakes reveal a landscape progressively stripped of its tree cover across the 5th and 6th centuries CE. Aksumite agricultural expansion, the terraced hillsides, the irrigated fields, the charcoal-hungry bronze workshops and lime-burning kilns had consumed the forests that once held the volcanic earth in place. Without root systems to anchor the highland soils, the seasonal rains carry them down slope. Crop yields decline. The carrying capacity of the plateau, which had fed a capital city and provisioned military campaigns across the Red Sea, quietly diminishes. Then the wider world shifts in ways no highland king can control. Around 615 CE, a small group of early Muslim followers, persecuted in Mecca, cross the Red Sea and seek refuge with the Aksumite king, the Negus. Islamic tradition records that the Negus received them with dignity and refused to surrender them to their pursuers. It is a moment of remarkable intersection. The old Christian Highland Kingdom and the new faith of Arabia briefly sharing the same shore. But the world this encounter represents is already in motion toward transformation. By 622 CE, Islam has become a political force. By 641 CE, Arab armies complete the conquest of Egypt, severing the Mediterranean world from its ancient connections. The Red Sea, which Aksum had commanded for centuries as its commercial highway, passes into a new geopolitical order. Arab merchants, sailing from the ports of the Hejaz and the Persian Gulf, increasingly dominate the routes that once made Obelisks indispensable. Obelisks itself falls silent. The harbor that once received Roman amphorae and Indian cotton, that once loaded ivory and obsidian onto vessels bound for Alexandria and Ctesiphon, is abandoned by approximately the 7th century CE. The archaeological record at the site shows no meaningful occupation after this period. The keys that once defined Aksum's reach into the world are swallowed by coastal sediment and time. The coinage tells the same story, with precision. Aksumite kings had minted gold, silver, and bronze coins for nearly 4 centuries. A mark of sovereign confidence shared by almost no other African state of the ancient world. The last identifiable Aksumite coins are dated to the early 7th century CE. After that, silence. No new dies are cut, no new royal portraits stamped into metal. The mint that once broadcast royal names in Ge'ez and Greek across the trade networks of 3 continents simply stops. The stately field of Aksum, where granite towers once proclaimed the permanence of kings, receives no new monuments. The great building program that produced the Dungar Palace complex and the towering obelisks of the royal necropolis halts entirely. The city does not burn. It does not fall to a conquering army. It simply ceases to grow and then begins, almost imperceptibly, to empty. The political center of gravity drifts southward. The Highland Kingdom that had defined itself through Aksum, through its stele, its church, its royal tombs, begins the long process of reorientation toward the Lasta region, toward the territories that will eventually produce the Zagwe dynasty and, centuries later, the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. The name Aksum does not vanish from memory or from reverence, but as a living imperial capital, as the engine of a Red Sea superpower, It recedes into the highland silence from which it once so brilliantly emerged. What remains is the red earth, the standing stones, and the faith. The red earth does not forget. Long after the last Aksumite coin was struck, long after the harbor at Obelisks fell silent and the monumental building program ceased, the civilization that had shaped the Horn of Africa continued its transformation. Not into absence, but into something more durable than empire. It became identity. The Zagwe dynasty emerges from the Lasta region of the Central Highlands around the 10th century CE, inheriting the spiritual and political vocabulary of Aksum without inheriting its geography. These are Christian kings ruling a Christian kingdom, conducting their liturgy in Ge'ez, venerating the same saints, maintaining the same apostolic succession that Frumentius had established 6 centuries earlier. They do not abandon the Aksumite inheritance. They carry it southward, deeper into the highlands, and there they do something extraordinary. Between approximately 1181 and 1221 CE, under the reign of King Lalibela, 11 churches are carved directly from the living, red volcanic tuff of the Lasta Mountains, not built upon the earth, carved into it. Workers descend into trenches cut around solid rock formations, shaping walls, windows, columns, and roof lines from a single continuous mass of stone. The Church of Bete Georgis, St. George, emerges as a perfect cruciform tower sunk into a rectangular pit, its exterior decorated with recessed crosses in 3 descending tiers. It stands approximately 12 meters tall, entirely monolithic, entirely underground, entirely astonishing. These churches are not imitations of Aksumite architecture. They are its spiritual descendants, the same impulse toward permanence in stone, the same fusion of faith and ambition, expressed in a new landscape and a new century. In 1270 CE, the Solomonic dynasty reclaims power under Yakuno Amlak, asserting direct genealogical descent from the Aksumite kings and, through them, from the union of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, the founding myth of Ethiopian royal legitimacy. This lineage is codified in the Kebra Nagost, the Glory of Kings, a Ge'ez epic compiled around 1314 CE that transforms Aksumite history into sacred narrative. The Ark of the Covenant in this tradition was brought from Jerusalem to Aksum by Menelik, the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and rests still within the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. The claim is theological, national, and eternal simultaneously. The institutions Aksum built prove more resilient than its walls. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, tracing its unbroken succession from Frumentius to the present, serves approximately 36 million faithful today. The Ge'ez script, developed under Aksumite rule from its South Arabian antecedents, remains the liturgical language of that church, ancient syllables still spoken in highland sanctuaries. Ethiopia itself, alone among African nations, repelled European colonization at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, in part because it possessed a continuous tradition of statehood, written law, and Christian identity reaching back to the 4th century CE. The stelae still stand in Aksum. Stele II, looted by Italian forces in 1937 and erected in Rome, was finally returned to Ethiopia in 2008 and re-erected in its original field. The stone came home. The red earth received it. And in that return, something of the ancient kingdom's permanence reasserted itself, not as nostalgia, but as living continuity between a civilization that ruled the ancient world and the nation that carries its memory forward into the present. Aksum did not merely end. It transformed, endured, and refused to be forgotten. Thank you for traveling through this extraordinary civilization with us. If this series has brought the ancient world a little closer, consider subscribing so you never miss the next journey into history.